From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A New York jury finds Donald Trump liable for sexually abusing a woman in the 1990s, ordering him to pay $5 million. Will this shake up the presidential race in 2024? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. After deliberating for about 3 hours on Tuesday, a jury found Donald Trump liable for battery and then for defamation against the writer E. Jean Carroll, who said that he assaulted her sometime in the 1990s in a dressing room after a chance encounter at a New York department store. Here's the piece of the statement from Carroll. Quote, "I filed this lawsuit against Donald Trump to clear my name and to get my life back. Today, the world finally knows the truth. This victory is not just for me, but for every woman who has suffered because she was not believed," unquote. And here is the statement from Donald Trump on Truth Social this morning. You have to read this. It's in all caps. "I have no idea who this woman who made this false and totally fabricated accusation is. Hopefully, justice will be served on appeal." Kim, what do you make of this? The jury has ordered Trump to pay $5 million. He's saying he's going to appeal, and I'm not sure exactly what the timeline for that process looks like. But what do you make of this verdict and any political impact it might have on the 2024 election, in particular the Republican primaries?
Yeah, it's just really hard, Kyle, as it is whenever you have one of these cases that involves an allegation of sexual abuse or assault, but one that happened many, many years ago and essentially becomes a little bit more of a he said, she said. I'd break it out here on the battery claim. Remember, this stems from an allegation that they were both in a Bergdorf Goodman's department store, struck up a conversation. This ended up in some flirtatious talk. This is according to the accuser. They end up in a fitting room together where apparently he assaulted her. This was her claim. The problem here is obviously this is a very long time ago. The writer thinks that it happened around 1996, but couldn't be entirely sure exactly when it happened. There were no witnesses. And then she waited until 2019 to actually come out with this accusation. I think you add in there, she was coaxed to file this lawsuit by a vehement anti-Trump person, George Conway. The suit was also financed by another vehement anti-Trump person, Reid Hoffman. Does this mean that the claim isn't true? No. Is it possible he abused her? Yes. Is it also possible that he was falsely accused? And at a time when there are a lot of Me Too accusations going around, yes, that's also possible. So it's hard to know in terms of the truth of this allegation, beyond the fact that, look, the jury did find for her in the end. And so we can't discount that. That's a jury finding. The defamation charge kind of then hinges on that battery charge, and that it stems to a tweet or a comment that Trump made in 2022 saying that this was a hoax and that none of this happened. And so by finding that it had, Mr. Trump was therefore also guilty of defaming her. Look, in terms of the race, this is a tough one because there's going to be a lot of people. It's unfortunate that many folks have brought so many of these accusations over the years, from the media to the left, whether it be impeachment, whether it be the Trump-Russia collusion hoax, etc. And that has caused many Republicans to simply tune these accusations out. So I think you can be assured that there's a certain segment of the Republican voting population that isn't going to let this affect their thinking about the race one way or another in terms of their openness to the potentiality as Trump as the nominee. I think for those that already have grave questions about the president, this would probably harden their positions even further. But I don't see an immediate impact. And I certainly don't see Trump, for instance, doing anything like withdrawing.
The distance between now and when these events occurred in the 1990s is the reason that there is statutes of limitations in criminal law for most crimes. E. Jean Carroll filed this suit under a law signed in 2022 in New York, the Adult Survivors Act, which provided victims of abuse a one-time opportunity to sue the alleged abuser. Another thing I would point out is that the allegation, at least one of the allegations here, was rape, and the jury found Donald Trump not liable for that. That's something that the president's attorney, Joe Tacopina, focused on. He said this was a rape case all along, and the jury rejected that, made other findings. Will obviously be appealing those other findings. On the point about some of the funding from this lawsuit coming from a Democratic donor, Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, just to get something from him on the record here, he told the Washington Post this week, "We didn't encourage the lawsuit to happen. We only got on board after she had already filed it and was down the road. So you're not trying to create something that isn't substantive real." He said that his team looked at it and thought her voice should be heard, that because she was challenging someone who was so much more wealthy and powerful, it shouldn't be squashed, unquote. And Kate, one more thing that I would add here before I let you have a chance to get in is this is a civil case, not a criminal case. So the beyond reasonable doubt standard that people are familiar with from criminal cases does not apply here. Instead, it's a preponderance of the evidence standard. And so basically, the jurors in this case are asked to decide whether it's more likely than not that this happened as E. Jean Carroll alleges, or whether President Trump's denials are more likely than not, which is a much lower standard of evidence than a criminal trial.
Right, Kyle. I do think that's important to bear in mind that this is not a criminal conviction and it is operating under lower standards of evidence. One other detail that I think is important is that the jury did not find Trump to pass this standard as liable on the accusation of rape. I do think that, ironically enough, probably makes his appeal chances less likely, because what you see here is that you have a jury that looked at the evidence and made distinctions based on what they thought met the preponderance of the evidence standard and what did not. So I do think you have a jury that did do a thorough review of the evidence here. But I do think, to your point, there are reasons why some voters will doubt the veracity of the finding and also conclude that we will never know what happened in this instance and whether the allegations are true. Just to follow up on a point that Kim made, I think one regrettable reality about this verdict is that one reason a segment of the public will take it less seriously than they really should is because so many of these other operations against Trump have looked so blatantly political. Now, let's say you accept Reid Hoffman's analysis there and don't think this was one of them. Well, we have a history here where Trump's opponents try to get him via impeachment. We have Alvin Bragg's carom shot case, campaign finance. There is a history here that looks as though what Trump's opponents are doing are trying to try him in the court of public opinion and not get an honest airing of the facts. This is an example of why that strategy is such bad judgment, and the cost of his opponents showing no restraint is that when something like this comes along, a moment that everyone should pause and really review the evidence and take stock of Trump's character and what this data point says, a part of the public just thinks, I can't really trust what I'm reading here.
To flesh out a bit of the evidence that the jury heard, so E. Jean Carroll testified about her own memories. She called two witnesses who said that they heard from her shortly after this alleged incident took place. So that was contemporaneous evidence that she was speaking to someone else about what had happened to her. And then she called two women who said that Trump did similar sort of things to them, groping them, sexually assaulting them in some manner. And here again, the differences between a criminal and a civil trial, I think, come into play. President Trump did not call any witnesses in his defense. And Kim, that's something that you sometimes see in a criminal trial where there's a very high burden of proof, and it is up to prosecutors to prove that this happened. But here we have a situation where the jury can decide with 51% confidence that Trump is liable. I'm a little bit perplexed at the decision not to call any witnesses in the president's defense here. And that goes to President Trump's own decision not to testify on his own behalf. And again, in a criminal trial, declining to testify in your own defense cannot be used against you. The jury is instructed that that is not prejudicial. Not so in a civil trial. In a civil trial, a jury is allowed to make inferences from that. If you just decline to testify, a jury is allowed to wonder whether it might be because you don't think your story would stand up under cross-examination. And so, Kim, I mean, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a defense attorney, but it does seem to me like the jury was presented with a lot of evidence, a lot of testimony from the accusations here, and not much from the defense.
Yeah, the Trump strategy seemed to be instead to leave it to his lawyer to cross-examine E.G. Carroll on the witness stand. And they did bring up some things that I think that had I been on the jury certainly would have made me wonder a little bit about the lawsuit. They pointed out that in past social media posts, E.G. Carroll had raved about how she was a massive fan of The Apprentice, which was obviously one of Donald Trump's television shows. They talked about how she had at one point, again in social media, joked about having sex with Donald Trump for money. These raise the questions: if you really were assaulted by somebody, would this be the behavior you would have? Her response in these was it was better to joke about things than to cry about them. They also brought up the fact that she had also once accused former CBS CEO Les Moonves of assault and asked why she hadn't also pursued litigation against him. Her answer in this case, he had not rubbed it in her face the way she felt Donald Trump had, and she felt she needed to go specifically after Trump. So they brought up all of these things, essentially attempting to poke holes in her credibility and in her account of how things had happened. Clearly, wasn't enough. And yes, that does certainly suggest that it was a flawed strategy in that regard, and that Donald Trump would have been well served to have brought somebody in that could have attested to his character, or I don't know, anything that would provide evidence that would cast doubt on things. They chose not to do it. And so they were left essentially with a decision. Did they believe that E. Jean Carroll and the other people were credible? And apparently the jury really, really did. And then you had to weigh on that on the other side, the fact that there's a long history here of Trump making inappropriate comments about women, etc. A long history prior to his presidency of his sort of star life, as it were, with prominent people. And that clearly weighed on the jury as well, too.